everyone to this long-awaited, eagerly awaited talk. I'm Arthur Versluis. I'm chair of the Department of Religious Studies here at MSU, and I'm really pleased to be able to welcome everyone to this talk tonight. We're fortunate to be hosting Dr. Seyyed Hossein Nasr. Dr. Nasr began his studies, many of you may not know this, or some of you may not know this, but his original academic work at MIT was in physics. And upon graduation from MIT, he also did graduate work in geophysics, but then got his PhD in the history of science and philosophy at Harvard. He taught at Tehran University, was appointed head of the Iranian Academy of Philosophy, eventually took a position at Temple University and then at George Washington University, where he is university professor today. Seyyed Hossein Nasr, currently professor of University Professor of Islamic Studies at George Washington University in Washington, is one of the foremost scholars of Islam today. Author and editor of more than 50 books and 500 articles that have been translated into many different languages. We're very pleased to welcome Dr. Nasr to Michigan State University as part of our continuing multi-year series in religious studies called Religion and Science Beyond the Polemics. As you know, MSU this April is hosting the MSU Science Festival, and this talk precedes it, but was created with this in mind, to join with the MSU Science Festival but not compete with it. On April 18th, the Science Festival will feature as one of its events a panel discussing historical convergences of religion and science in Europe and North America. And we invite you to visit that, to join us for that panel then. Tonight's talk fits this larger context perfectly. And we'd like to thank our event co-sponsors, which include Muslim Studies Program, the Department of History, Muslim benefactors of the Muslim Studies Endowment, the Religious Studies Endowment, the College of Arts and Letters, College Interfaith Council, and ASMSU, all of whom have made this event possible. And so, without further ado, I'd like us to extend a warm welcome to Dr. Nasr tonight. We'll speak on the themes in which he is the leading expert in the world: Islam, science, and nature.
Talks shall begin with the name of God, and that's what we did. Now, the subject of tonight's talk contains three words: Islam, science, and nature. The word Islam I shall not talk about, the word nature I will not talk about, but the word science I want to say a word about before I begin my discourse, because I think there's nothing more important than precision when one speaks about such delicate and difficult and convoluted subjects. The word science has more than one meaning, and the fact that it's a polysemic term has caused a great deal of confusion in many circles. In the English language, when we say science, it really means modern, natural, and mathematical disciplines, which we call modern sciences. In French, its meaning is much more extensive. The word science includes the humanities, and now the word human sciences is gradually entering into the English language, and 2 or 3 universities, including my own at George Washington, and now doctoral programs in the human sciences. That's a new change, but until now, the word science was not understood in relation to the humanities very much in this country. And in other European languages, the term is even more general, like the word Wissenschaft in German, which means every form of organized knowledge. So let's stick to the English understanding of the word science, and the word I shall use it today is as it's currently used in the English language, except to extend its usage to Islamic science, and to show why this term is to be used and why it differs from how we understand the word science in the English language today. Now, when we talk about Islam, science, and nature, what could this subject entail? What could one talk about? One could talk about the history of Islamic science, or Islamic sciences of nature. One could talk about the whole discourse of Islam and science as part of the general discourse of religion and science, which has been central to Western thought since really the 17th century, since the Galileo trial, in one sense or another, since the early 17th century. Or one could talk about Islam and nature, the whole question of the natural environment, the environmental crisis, the religion and the environment, that vast subject which is so central to us all. All these three are implicated by the subject that was presented to me to speak about tonight. And I shall not limit myself to any one of these three, but I shall make some comments that will really include all of them. First of all, let me say that this whole discourse of science in its relation to Islam is one of the most widespread and central discourses in the Islamic world today. All the way from oil-rich monarchies like Saudi Arabia, to revolutionary governments like Algeria, to Islamic revolutionary governments like the Islamic Republic of Iran, wherever you are in the Islamic world, this debate goes on. There's a central debate, irrespective of the theological, political, ideological positions that various governments and their followers in various universities and intellectual centers hold. It's remarkable how widespread this debate is. I once said jokingly, some years back, unfortunately it's not a joke, that the only thing upon which modern humanity agrees upon is the destruction of nature. Whether you're a communist, capitalist, North America, South Africa, Soviet Union, was that around. Anywhere else, we all agree that we all are doing this together, destroying the earth. Now this question of Islamic science is something like that in the Islamic world. Whatever political or philosophical position people hold, this is a subject that is very central to the concern of the Islamic world today. Moreover, it's more important than that for the future of Islam, for the understanding of the Islamic world today, for an understanding of the intellectual significance of Islamic science. Scientism, that is a kind of worship of modern science, is very much part of the religion science discourse in the Islamic world today. I could spend a whole hour just discussing this issue. I shan't, but I want to point this out. Since Jamaluddin Afghani, a famous Persian pan-Islamicist and rabble-rouser and intellectual of the 19th century, went to Kabul and called himself Afghani in order to go to Egypt and said that he was a Sunni because he was originally Shiite. He's from Tehran. Asadabad outside of Tehran. Anyway, Jamaluddin, the famous Jamaluddin, started to write in the 19th century. He made the following claim. Science in Arabic is ilm. I-L-M. The word I-L-M in Arabic corresponds really to scientia in Latin, not so much to science in English. It refers to all organized knowledge, all knowledge. But anyway, science has, in its more limited Anglo-Saxon usage, is also ilm. And he said that this ilm was given by us to the West. They developed it for a while. It's ours, now we're taking it back. And he began to identify the Quranic dictum to seek knowledge with modern science. This goes back to Jamaluddin, and I believe, as a humble Islamic scholar who's worked for 50 years in this field, that this was worse than cholera for the Islamic world, intellectual cholera, because it prevented for over a century and a half serious thinking. Every Islamic government covered the Islamic world, whether Islamic, leftist, rightist, up, down, whatever it is, will always give scholarship for students to go and study science and engineering. It will never give any scholarship for students to study the humanities in the West, or almost never. All Islamic parents practically who live in America, or live in Europe, or those who are westernized in the Islamic world, all they want their children is to become either doctors or engineers. You said jokingly in Persian, if a man comes to ask for your daughter's wife, if he's not a doctor or engineer, don't let him into the house. Nobody would even give a doctor. It's a social phenomenon that's all over the Islamic world and goes back to scientism, which is very, very strong and is lethal because it is also unconscious. Nobody really knows about it. And governments defend the defense of science with a remarkable amount of energy and even almost religious attachment, without really doing anything about it. I believe the fact that the Islamic world has done so little modern science is because of scientism. The worship of modern science has prevented the Islamic world from doing science. This is a very big claim that I'm making. But I'm perhaps one of the very few people that has the right to make this claim. Besides studying as a physicist, I was for many years president of the most important scientific university in the Islamic world, Sharif University, with students are all over MIT and Stanford, everywhere else, and we're making atomic energy centers in Iran without the help of the United States, certainly, or any other Western power. So I know a little bit of what I'm talking about. And I don't want to go into personal anecdotes, but one of the very first things I did when I went first to this university, the very first day I assembled the professors. I said, look, none of you know science better than I do, but this is not a place for scientism. This is where they're supposed to learn Western science, but as science, not as God. The worship of science has to stop. But this is one of the very important traits of the Islamic world. In Saudi Arabia, which is worshipped more? Traditional Islamic art or modern science? All you have to look at the monstrosity just built next to the Kaaba. You don't have to say anything more. One of the greatest really affronts to Islamic civilization in the whole history of Islam. That occurred in the last 2-3 years. You don't need to say anything more about that. So it's a very major problem. And if you're going to discuss the question of Islam, science and nature, you must pay considerable attention to the presence of the situation in the Islamic world today, and rethink the whole issue. Reams and reams of paper, books and books and books have been written on this issue. There are even Quranic commentaries, called it Tafsir al-Alimi in Arabic, scientific commentary, which began in Egypt with Al-Iskandarani in the late 19th century, which continued to our own very day, in which commentaries come out of the Quran, some of them in many volumes, showing that the microbe invented by Louis Pasteur corresponds to that particular verse of the Quran. I wonder what verse of the Quran will correspond to the terrible virus I have now. No commentator has told me yet. But I'm just making a joke. It's this asinine, childish way of trying to correlate the Word of God with the ever-transient Western science that changes every century. This is something which has been going on. We have to rethink the way these terms are related together. In order to do so, I want to pose certain considerations in this lecture of what are the real issues that are involved, how we should go about this issue, how we should think about it. And why am I doing this? What use is this? If scientism has taken over the whole of the space of the Islamic world, why am I wasting my time? It's a good question to ask. The answer is that it has not quite succeeded. When I began as a young scholar in Iran over 50 years ago, speaking against the evils of modern science, just evils of the application of modern science, the limitations of modern science, the fact that good and evil are combined together, that does good and does also evil. I was met with tremendous opposition. Had it not been for the fact that I had degrees from the best American universities and know a lot more science than my opponents, and I came from a family of educators who were very famous in Iran who could talk with me so easily, I would have been just bulldozed over by opponents, by modernists. And whether they were leftists, pro-communist, two-day party members, or pro-monarchy members, didn't matter at all. On this issue, nobody wanted to have any discussion of the nature of modern science at all present. So why am I doing it? From the 50 years ago when that began, now the voices is my own are not totally silent in the Islamic world. There are people throughout the Islamic world, there are new programs like University of Malaya, in Iran, in Turkey, new programs in the philosophy of science, which are based on the Islamic philosophy of science, not the materialistic 17th century philosophy of science, which is developed, of course, step by step into the 20th century, into positivism and logical positivism, which dominates the American philosophical scene right now. So it's not useless. When we discuss Islam, science, and nature, we're not discussing a religion or civilization which did not produce major scientific tradition. Suppose we talk about the Yoruba tradition in Africa. It's a very great tradition of black Africa. Suppose we're trying to establish modern science in Nigeria, in the Yoruba region of Nigeria. The Yoruba produced remarkable poetry, remarkable psychology, certain forms of folk medicine, but they did not have a major scientific tradition. The confrontation with what is science would be very, very different from Islamic civilization. Islamic civilization, from the 8th to the 15th century, for 700 years, was the foremost civilization in the world from a scientific point of view. If you use the word science here, not as modern Western science, but science as organized the study of nature or mathematics. If you use that definition, it was the foremost. Neither the Chinese nor the Western civilization could compete with it. The Chinese for a while were the nearest competitors, but they didn't have as extensive activity as Islamic civilization did. Even the Mongol invasion did not undo it. And the histories of Islamic science written in the West, including by my dear Professor George Sarton at Harvard, who wrote the first great history of Islamic science, in fact, history of all science in the West, established Islamic history of science and discipline at Harvard and later other American universities. Though even he was not aware of it, that it continued even after the Mongol invasion, in the field of astronomy, in the field of mathematics, many other fields, and continued to the 15th century. That is 700 years. The West has been the most active in science for only about 500 years. There's no guarantee that it's going to continue another 200 years necessarily in the same way. Remember what Toynbee said that in the 21st century they would hang every scientist by a tree. I hope that doesn't happen to many scientist friends. But we do not really know. So this is, first of all, quite a remarkable achievement. Anyone who talks about Islam and science and overlooks the 700-year tradition of remarkable achievements in almost every field of science, from the invention of new sciences such as trigonometry and algebra, to the expansion of existing sciences such as geometry and medicine, and you could go on and on and on, astronomy, biology, this, that. Islamic science is really a remarkable corpus of scientific achievement of Islamic civilization. And it's doubly significant because it did not cause what modern science caused in the West. It did not eclipse Christianity, it did not eclipse Islam as modern science eclipsed Christianity. It did not destroy the religious cosmology worldview as the Galilean worldview replaced the Christian worldview. So even the most devout Christian today doesn't look at the sky as God's firmament. It takes that as a poetic utterance. The actual experience of the sky as God's firmament is forgotten now. This didn't happen in the Islamic world. So anyone who talks about Islamic science and just overlooks this debate, this remarkable tradition, is simply really chopping down the wrong tree, is going up the wrong path. Because any civilization that has activity in any field, if it wants to revive it without paying attention to what it already had, it will either die or will never not succeed in doing so. It's impossible to, let's say, start English poetry anew after reading Jalaluddin Rumi and forget about Shakespeare. Let's start poetry all over new. You're not going to include it in create English poetry. It's the same way with Islamic science. I say this because a lot of the debate that's going on in the Islamic world today goes at two extreme poles as far as this tradition is concerned. One is to just skip over it as if it didn't exist. We see this especially coming from countries which are extremely wealthy and are importing Western technology into the Islamic world very rapidly, like Saudi Arabia. But there was never a great tradition of science anyway. If anyone in this room can name me a famous Medinan geometer, I would be very grateful. Thank you very much. Probably not. They're great scholars of Quran, of Hadith, of law, and so on, the great center of Islamic learning, but of religious sciences, but not of the mathematical, astronomical sciences. So they have no interest. And all the debate that goes on brushes this over completely if it didn't exist. And the other antipode is that we don't do anything at all about science because Biruni was great. That's the other exaggeration of the other end, was the disease in the Islamic world. Also, we name all of our schools after Avicenna and Farabi and Biruni and so on and so on. But don't pay attention at all to the science that they did, nor even to serious science. Nor even serious science. Totally false. Every great civilization of the world, Chinese, Indian, Greek, Babylonian, Islamic, medieval, Christian, they had periods of interest in science, and then they turned to other fields of endeavor. Chinese civilization is especially interesting because of a 4,000-year history. I mean, totally isolated civilization. Not totally, because I can't have Islamic astronomy and the like, but relatively isolated. And there are periods of great activity in the sciences, periods of activity in other things. There's no guarantee. We have the idea that the greatness of civilization is only marked by its scientific achievements. That's not necessarily the case. That's not necessarily the case. So even this question is not pertinent. But the reality that if you're going to have an Islamic revival of science in a serious sense, you have to take cognizance of this tradition. That reality is unavoidable, I believe. Both because of the historical heritage and also philosophically. Because every science is based on a particular philosophy of nature. It's too bad the lesson in this class, so I don't have time. It's a technical matter to go into it with you. There's no such thing as science as science. Every science is based on a certain presumption of concerning the nature of reality, the nature of the known, the nature of the knower, and the nature of the instrument of knowledge. There's no exception whatsoever. Absolutely no exception. And Islamic science had its own philosophy of nature, philosophy of science. A very, very important field we're really now trying to revive. Myself and a number of colleagues, eminent Islamic philosophers, who part of the Islamic work over the last half century. Now, as I said, we have three at these universities which give MA and PhD degrees in Islamic philosophy of science, which is just beginning and getting off the ground. The next generation will make a lot of impact, because within that context, that the Western science can be brought into the Islamic world and really Islamicized, made Islamic, not just as a foreign body. So this is the first, a very, very important point to know. The second, to look for the trajectory of the relationship between Islam, science, and religion to be similar to that of Christianity, science, and religion is false. There are certain similarities, of course. Certain similarities occur. You teach the child that nature is nothing but atoms and there's no God, that affects the child, whether it's a Buddhist or a Muslim or a Hindu or a Christian or a Jew, doesn't make any difference. But no doubt about that. But if you look at the great historical unfolding that took place, they're not the same by any means. And I just want to allude to one point which is very important. This is a subject for many lectures itself. In Christianity, because of the excessive naturalism of the Greek world into which Christianity was born, Christianity pitted itself very strongly against Greek naturalism. It avoided at all costs identifying nature with any divinity, with anything sacred at first. Very, very strongly. And it made a very clear distinction between the supernatural and the natural. What Catholic theology now calls grace and nature. And it's much of Catholic theology called grace and nature. Such is not the case of Islam. Islam was not faced with an agnostic naturalism of the late antiquity. The pagan Arabian naturalism was very, very different. It was of the philosophical naturalism. And Islam never distinguished completely between the natural and the supernatural. Many decades ago, I once gave a lecture in Chicago on this one word, the word barakah. The word barakah is the closest translation in Arabic to the word grace. But barakah also exists in bread. We say grace, then we eat bread as good Christians. But in Islam, the barakah is also already inside the bread. Sometimes we call bread barakah in Arabic. And also in Persian, other Islamic language. The word bread itself, because rizq is nourishment. The word barakah is both the supernatural and natural. There's something natural in the supernatural, something supernatural in the natural. And this very strong delineation separating the two never existed. It is this which prevented Islam from ever secularizing nature. Those very Muslims who were developing the concept of impetus, one of the most subtle concepts of physics, which even works in quantum mechanics and atomic physics. That is a product of M times V. This was developed first by Ibn Sina, Avicenna. The very, very important concept of physics, although the physicists students know how important it is, I don't have to go into it. One of the most important concepts of physics, as important as energy and mass. This concept was developed within a world of nature which was not secularized. Nature was never completely natural in the modern sense of the term. That is decapitated, spiritually speaking. Nature was always impregnated by the presence of the sacred. And so in contrast to what a lot of the neo-Salafi and neo-rationalistic and neo-Wahhabi so-called thought, I don't know if it should be called thought or not, but anyway, mental process is called in the modern world, and Islam is against all of these things. It's a very rational and rationalistic religion and so on and so on. That's a very superficial way of seeing it. Very, very superficial way of seeing it. And the best proof of it is the Quran itself. In the Quran, first of all, non-human agents, elements of nature, participate with human agents in the Quranic revelation. God oftentimes swears by natural things, ash-shamsu wal-qamar. God swears by the sun and the moon, by the pomegranate and the fig, different fruits, different vegetables exist in the Quran as spiritual entities. The accusation made by a lot of missionaries against Islam that Islam is naturalistic because it doesn't distinguish between naturalism and the supernatural is absolutely absurd from the Islamic point of view. It isn't that at all. It's the realization of the presence of the sacred in all of God's creation, not only in man. We are ashraful makhluqat, the most noble of all creatures, and therefore also the most wretched of all creatures. As the corruption of the best is the worst, as it says in Latin. That's why we are corrupted to the worst of creatures, worse than the ant that walks on the ground. But also we can be God's various creatures. But we're not only a creature of God. Everything in the universe is a creature of God. And the Quran has a whole theology of nature. It's connected with that. Over the years I've talked about so often of the religion of the order of nature. There's a long chapter on this. First of all, as you know, but for those of you from this university who do not know, the verses of the Quran are called ayah. A-Y-A-H. Ayah. Ayah means portent, sign, symbol, indication. There are some pious Muslims who don't know English well and refuse to translate the verse of the Quran to verse. They think that is poetry, and the Quran is not poetry. That's of course absurd. But it's always been criticized by a friend from Saudi Arabia. Why do you translate the word ayah into verse? But this verse. But verse does not mean only poetry. Like the verse of the Bible. Book of Psalms, verse 132. That verse, V, is ayah in Arabic. So the verse of the Quran is ayah. All phenomena of nature are also ayah, called ayah. Ayatullah. All phenomena of nature. And all that occurs within the soul of man is also ayah. So you have a triangular relationship in the sacred text, the macrocosm and the macrocosm. In the sacred text, nature and men and women, human beings, us. We all contain ayah, the signs of God within ourselves. And it's by reading these signs within ourselves that we're able to read the signs of God upon the horizons. And neither of these can be do without the help of the signs of God that come from the Quran. That's the key to both. The Quran mentions we shall show them our signs within themselves upon the horizons. until it becomes known unto them that is the truth. The Quran is very, very explicit about that. So you have a whole theology of nature that no Muslim, in the name of progress, reason, rationalism, anything else can deny unless they stop being Muslims. It is not at all accidental that all deniers of the inner meaning of the Quran are the very people who in the 20th century have become the terrorists and the extremists and all of these people. This is not accidental. By any means, they have a political consequence of the deepest kind. It's like yanking at the inner anchor. So the boat just starts floating down the sea and gets caught in the storm. Where it goes, where it goes. So, according to Islam, nature participates in divine revelation, as does man. Revelation is not only a human phenomenon, it's a cosmic phenomenon. And this is true of all revelations, but in Islam, for example, it's said it's a folk's culture, but that doesn't mean that is meaningless. Now, for example, when Gabriel appeared to the Prophet, certain valleys, mountains opened up, and you go to Afghanistan, there are places they said that opened up when the Battle of Khaybar took place, and all kinds of things like that you hear all over the Islamic world. This is not felt something to be taken lightly. It means the understanding that the Muslims had of the participation of the cosmic ambience in the religious revelation. So religion is not only a human element, it's also a cosmic one, and nature participates in it. And this is a very, very profound and important element, the forgetting of which would make it impossible for the Islamic world to ever be able to integrate modern forms of learning to an authentic Islamic perspective. Finally, Islam has always possessed many what I would call sapiental philosophies of nature. In the West, since the 17th century, the predominant philosophy of nature took over, which comes from Cartesianism, based on a dualism that separates the knower from the known and reduces the known to pure extension, to pure quantity, a so-called mind and matter. And against that, there were other philosophy of nature which tried to resist, especially in Germany. Philosophia and other philosophies like that. Rosenberg Lewis, your own professor, did several very important articles on that issue. And even in America, the New England Transcendentalists, they didn't want to surrender completely to the Cartesian dominant, Cartesian bifurcation that dominated over the philosophy of science or philosophy of nature in European science. Now in Islam also, not one but many philosophies of nature. But none of them were based on reductionism. The reductionism which is inherent in Cartesian dualism. Nature was never reduced simply to its material element. The greater was never made to come out of the lesser. Atoms did not bang against each other to create Hafiz and Sadi. Nobody ever thought in those terms. And many other examples which I could give. And there are not one, but several rich philosophies of nature, from the peripatetic to the Shirazi to other schools. Over my lifetime, I've discussed several of these in many different books and articles, and others have written about them. Islam possesses a very rich, not only history of science, but philosophy of science, whose resuscitation is a sine qua non for the integration of Western science into Islamic ambience, into an Islamic framework, rather just being on a loan like a 747, which lands from some airport into Cairo, Tehran. It's not an Egyptian technology, it's a Western technology landing on the Cairo tarmac, which is quite something else. Now, if we consider all these issues together, we will see that it's very, very important to rethink the relationship between Islam, science, and nature. First of all, we have to write Islamic science, its history, from the Islamic point of view. So the place to begin. And to write the meaning of Islamic science from its point of view, its own point of view. We owe a lot to Western scholars who've written about the history of Islamic science. Great scholars like Sartre and Wiedemann, people like most of the German scholars of the early 20th century, already pioneers who produced over 10,000 articles in European language and Islamic science. Over 10,000 articles we have done. It's such an important field. Well, everybody talks about science, yes, science, but nobody does any work. That is really important. So we need to do, first of all, our own history of science. Many people accuse me of being against modern science. I'm not against modern science. I spent years of my life studying it. I'm against the worship of modern science. I worship God, I don't worship science. And I understand the limitations of modern science. I've studied years of philosophy and science, and I'm willing to debate anybody. I've known people like Pierre Duhem, Santillana, the greatest philosopher of science, Bertrand Russell of the 20th century. It's a very serious matter. Muslims just cannot abdicate and not think. We have to think about this matter. That's what I propose. That's what I propose. And next, we have, on the one hand, the religion and science discourse. On the other hand, the environmental crisis discourse. The two do not meet oftentimes. Conferences are held completely separate from each other. When I was an advisor, theological advisor to the Templeton Foundation, I tried to advise Sir John Templeton to try to integrate these together. He wouldn't hear of it. He was interested in religion and science, he had no interest in the environment whatsoever. But they are very much interrelated, very much interrelated. The time has passed when people thought that the environmental crisis was just bad engineering. It's not a question of bad engineering or bad economics. It's a spiritual question. The environmental crisis is a spiritual question, crisis of humanity. It's a crisis that began within us, that is now manifesting itself outwardly. The pollution you breathe in New York, we first breathe inwardly within ourselves. I've devoted a lifetime to this, and classical Islamic civilization. The same civilization which had a lot more mathematics and engineering and physics than Western civilization or Indian civilization and so forth. Nevertheless, it was environmentally remarkably sane. Its cities were built environmentally. Remarkable harmony and balance of the elements, of substances. It's agriculture. You study all of these things. It's astounding, absolutely astounding. For example, the use of movement of air through traditional architecture. The years that we had in southern Iran and in the Persian Gulf and in the Emirates and those things, which in fact circulated the air and therefore brought down the use of energy in order to keep cool. These were all remarkable invention discoveries based on the idea which today we would call an eco-philosophy. A fancy word did not exist in the old days, but a philosophy of the total environment. And as you know, the word for environment is muhit in Arabic. And this is the name of God. Wallahu ala kulli shay'in muhit. God is the ultimate environment. The ultimate environment within which we live and we die. And therefore, this came into Islamic civilization almost, not everyone was conscious of it, but of course the thinkers were conscious of it, as a means of creating an ambience in which there was a free flow between man and nature. The Islamic city was not a blemish upon the land. When the Mongols destroyed half of the cities of Persia, they receded back into the desert because of the material from which they were made. They were not environmentally dangerous. And many of them then became fields over which they planted wheat. Look at outside of Nishabur, the great city of Nishabur. And 1 million people in it. Everyone was put to death. 1 million people were killed in Nishabur by the Mongols. And they tore down all the houses. And they turned the water on it, the river on it. And they planted wheat. It was a wheat field for a long, long time. Then the new Nishabur arose in the middle of this, but the rest of it is still a wheat field. In the wheat fields, about 200 yards outside the wall of Nishabur, you dig, you get the old Nishabur, the bricks underneath the ground. That's how Islamic civilization lived. And now we have the total contrast. Indifference to the environmental crisis, building which is totally against every environmental law, against the climate, as long as some people in those countries, with the Persians, the Arabs, anything else, and their English and American partners make the money, the rest doesn't matter. And the supreme example, of course, is the high skyscrapers around Mecca, which reminded the hadith of the Prophet. It says, when the barefooted men build tall buildings around the house of God, the sign when the hour shall arrive. And one could not understand anything else from it. But we cannot wait for God for the hour to come. We have certain responsibilities ourselves. And so the question of the Islamic world having some of the most polluted cities on earth, Karachi, Tehran, Cairo. Of course, there are many other factors involved. Economic factors, social factors, flow from the villages, wars. I mean, the 1967 war destroyed Cairo. The flow of over 1 million people from Port Said and that area into Cairo within 2 months. That broke the whole structure of the city, more or less. The beautiful city, crown of all Arab cities. But despite all of these things, we have a very, very bad record. The environment has forced humanity to realize that we were made of a single body, as Sadi said. Human beings are members of a single body. Whether we like it or not, Chernobyl has an effect upon Sweden. After the people in Lapland developed cancer, something had nothing to do with them. We have no choice about that. And so we're stuck in this together. And to say, all right, we'll just ruin Nigeria when we get the oil out into Holland. As long as Holland will take care of the dikes and the environment is clean, that will be fine. That's not going to work in the long run. And since the Islamic world is a vast land stretching from the Pacific to the Atlantic, what the Islamic people do with their vast scientific heritage, the tremendous know-how, the intellectual heritage that they have, the remarkable resources that they have, and then their philosophies of nature, and their religion, which is based so much on the importance of nature participating in the spiritual life of man. What they do with themselves will not only affect themselves, obviously, and the future Islamic world, but it will affect everyone throughout the world. Let's hope for better days.